Hello and welcome. I'm Shelby Magid, the Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Thank you for joining us for this timely event today titled, Are Russia and North Korea Forming a New Arsenal of Autocracy? We are co-hosted by the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative. So we're going to address this question and start with our panelists and later turn to our audience Q&A. If you have a question at any time, please visit askac.org and I can pitch your questions to our expert panel. Again, that is askac.org to submit your questions. So it's my pleasure to introduce our panel. Thank you all for joining us. We are joined today by Ambassador John Herbst, the Senior Director of the Eurasia Center and a former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine. Marcus Garlauskas, the Director of the Indo-Pacific Security Initiative from the Skokov Center for Strategy and Security, and a former National Intelligence Officer for North Korea at the National Intelligence Council. And last but not least, Beth Sanner, a resident distinguished fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and a former Deputy Director for National Intelligence for Mission Integration, where she was the President's intelligence briefer from 2019 to 2021. So we're going to turn over to you first, Ambassador Herbst. So we are seeing Russia's relationships with both China and North Korea as critical to the Kremlin's capacity to evade sanctions imposed by the West over Russia's war in Ukraine. Now, evidence of North Korean arms use by the Russian military in Ukraine has recently been confirmed by both Washington and Kyiv. What specific military support is North Korea providing for Russia, and what impact have North Korean shipments had so far on Russia's capacity to target Ukraine?
Well, as I understand it, basically, since not long after the big invasion began 2 years ago, North Korea has been providing substantial amounts of ammunition to Russia. And this became important, say, by late 2022, as Moscow began to run out of some ammunition, because it was just pounding Ukraine mercilessly and not always effectively. But lately, there are very credible reports of North Korea sending far more sophisticated things than simply ammunition or shells. They have these KN-23 and KN-24 short-range ballistic missiles. The KN-23 has a range of up to 700 or 800 kilometers. The SN-24, which is KN-24, which is small, has a range of about 400 kilometers. And these things are serious weapons. It's worth pointing out that North Korea is giving Russia, which has its own longer range missiles, because Russia's been running out of them, because again, they've been using them at an exorbitant rate and unable to produce the way they had hoped to be able to produce, in part because of Western sanctions. But while North Korea gives Russia missiles which have a range of 700 kilometers, the Biden administration is still too timid to send Ukraine ATACMS with a range of 300 kilometers. That needs to change.
Thank you, Ambassador Herbst.
I left out the second part of your question while making my policy pitch to the White House. The fact that Russia was running out of its own missiles and running out of its own drones, which is why it became reliant on Iranian drones a few months into the big invasion, means that it can continue operations by receiving this stuff from Pyongyang. But it cannot necessarily do better now than it did before, because before it didn't do so well with its own missiles. So we will see more of the same. But unfortunately, the bottom line, Ukraine suffers more damage because other nasty partners are helping Russia conduct this aggression.
Thank you very much. Now, Beth, turning to you. In September, North Korean Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un paid a visit to Putin, spending a week in Russia's Far East to visit Russian military and technology sites and discuss closer cooperation. Now, over the weekend, the North Korean Foreign Ministry suggested that Putin was likely to visit North Korea soon to discuss further cooperation. From our vantage point here in the US, what does this collaboration send to other autocratic allies, such as Iran, and how does this message endanger US national security interests?
Well, other than it being, Kim's best working vacation ever, it definitely has some pretty big implications. And I think, I'll break it quickly into two things. I mean, one is this idea that that we have this connectedness of these threats from the European theater to the Asian theater, right? And so we have the four countries that are now this kind of axis of evil or resistance or autocracy, whatever one you want to pick. And this collaboration is getting closer, right? So in Iran, we're seeing preparations now for a new interstate treaty, and I think that the North Korean Russian relationship certainly. I mean, it's separate, but these things are kind of moving in tandem. And with the North Korean moving ahead, I think that the Iranian treaty will come to the fore very soon. And I think in the big picture, what this axis does is, really does create this threat to the international order. And in practical ways, right? In these two practical ways, one is that, the UN system, the reason that these countries are coming together is a lot about sanctions and being the victim, right, of international sanctions. But now that Russia and China are vetoing and making it very clear that they're going to veto even the sanctions that they voted for in the past or other resolutions they voted for in the past, really emboldens North Korea, Iran, and any other autocratic state, because they know that this challenge to the Western order is something that China and Russia are jointly going to be pushing and defending in international institutions, and they're getting a lot of play there. The second really practical effect, I think, is just on the weapon systems, as Ambassador Herbst just mentioned. So for the Ukrainian circumstance, but for the North Korean circumstance and for the Iranian circumstance, we can see we probably will see qualitative improvements in their military capacity to threaten U.S. and partnered interest in their regions. And so this is actually a quite serious and very real effect, no matter whether this axis is, kind of fragile in many ways. It absolutely is, but it doesn't take away these practical risks that we see as a result.
Thank you so much for laying that all out for us. Now, Marcus, building on that, what is Russia already doing in return for North Korea, and what might Putin do further to support North Korea in thanks for this concrete technical military support that Beth spoke about?
Yeah, so I think we should start at the strategic and political level first and note that Moscow, and to be fair, along with Beijing, has really been shielding North Korea from the effects of UN sanctions and giving it political cover for its provocative actions for a long time. And so in some ways, this may be North Korea paying Moscow back, right, for that support. But in very practical terms, I would say the sanctions violations and Russia's willingness to aid and abet that is just tremendous. And so the shipments of missiles to Russia themselves are flagrant violations of UN Security Council resolutions that, as Beth mentioned, Russia and China actually previously both voted for resolutions that would not allow North Korea to either produce these types of missiles or, of course, to sell them, to ship them. And then there's a huge body of evidence in the open source for years of the way that Russia has been continuing to trade with North Korea and allowing for massive violations of sanctions, everything from remittances coming from laborers to petroleum shipments going to North Korea and these sorts of things. And so I don't know for sure exactly what Russia is giving North Korea in exchange right now, but I doubt these missiles are donations to Russia. And given this track record again of sanctions violations, North Korea, I'm sure, is well, I wouldn't say I'm sure, but I suspect is benefiting quite a bit economically from this. But let's talk a little bit more specifically about some of the benefits to North Korea that are going on right now and go forward from these missiles themselves. So Russia firing these missiles into Ukraine is giving North Korea an opportunity essentially to test the performance of these missiles under operational conditions. And so when you look at the history of North Korean missile testing, there's often political responses to North Korean missile testing or drills or exercises, and then there's always this degree of skepticism that comes from experts looking at North Korean capabilities from the outside when they do these launches and say, well, these are under test conditions. How can we be sure they would actually work? Have they deployed these systems and these sorts of things? And so for North Korea to actually be able to see their missiles fired into Ukraine, and to be fair, not just North Korea, but for the world to see that these are not just test prototypes, but are actual missiles that can be used in combat. I think that provides a political advantage to North Korea, a messaging advantage, but also very specifically allows them to then evaluate the performance of these missiles, and then unfortunately potentially continue to refine and perfect them. But even more so, I'm concerned about what might come next. And the White House sounded a very clear warning on this in a press conference earlier this month. And they gave a specific list of some of the things that could flow to North Korea in return for these missiles being shipped to Russia, and including things like fighter aircraft, surface-to-air missiles, armored vehicles, ballistic missile production equipment and materials, and other advanced technologies. And so that's also really problematic. Anything that helps North Korea build up its already impressive program of weapons development and testing will increase North Korea's ability to pose a threat to South Korea, to the region, to our interests, to our friends and allies. So I do definitely see going forward a real risk that Russia could provide some real advantages in the military space to North Korea.
Thank you very much for that. As you bring up South Korea, what reaction might we expect from South Korea and Japan to this development?
Yeah, so it's really hard to say exactly what South Korea and Japan can really do about this. So there's a real challenge in our ability to interfere with the trade that North Korea has with China and Russia if they're not willing to actually cooperate and comply with UN sanctions. And of course, North Korea and Russia share a land border. And they have this, again, track record of working together for sanctions evasion. So I think that there's already political protests and statements coming from Seoul and Tokyo, and they're signing on, I think, to this larger effort to condemn this activity. But in terms of tangibly what they can do about it, it is pretty limited. And so I'm sure that they will work with us on different efforts. But I think a lot of this is going to require U.S. leadership. So what are we expecting from South Korea and Japan in this situation, and what can they practically do? So we'll see what happens. I mean, South Korea and Japan are both great allies, but I'm really not sure what they can or will do that would really have a major impact on these activities.
Thank you very much. So Ambassador Herbst, we've spoken about the role of sanctions already, but I'd like you to expand. What does Russia's apparent growing dependence on North Korea suggest about the impact of sanctions on their arms production? And if Russia did not have North Korea as a partner, what would its military longevity look like?
There's a great deal of, I would say, uncertainty and bad information regarding the impact of sanctions on Russia on this specific question and more broadly. There's right now a narrative that sanctions have not really worked because the Russian economy allegedly is growing at a rate of 3% or more. And people will talk about statistics from the IMF, which validate that analysis. But the only problem, as Yale professor Jeff Sonnenfeld has written, is that this is all based on Kremlin economic statistics, which sometimes can be confused or can be described as simply propaganda. I don't think there's any doubt that overall the sanctions have severely retarded Russian economic growth, although not to the point where Russia's decided it needs to change its aggressive foreign policy, needs to end its war in Ukraine. And I think that the greatest impact of sanctions has been on Russian arms production. And this is one of the two reasons why Russia has had to rely on Iran and now North Korea for drone and missile technology. Moscow has been unable to produce at the speed it would like because especially the restrictions on higher technology, dual-use technology, which is one part of the sanctions package, although a very specific part. Again, this is lost in the stories, not false stories, that a lot of the Russian weapons which are landing in Ukraine include Western parts. There is sanctions avoidance, and this undoubtedly could be tightened. But the point is that despite trying to run its arms factories, at three shifts a day, in other words, around the clock, 7 days a week, Moscow has been able to produce anything near like its requirements to conduct this ongoing massive bombardment of Ukraine, which again is why it needs North Korea's missiles and needs Iran's drones. So the sanctions are doing their work. They could be tightened. We should be seeking for ways to tighten them. We should be cracking down on countries and businesses that are helping get Western components into Russian hands. But we should not underestimate the positive impact in terms of our policy that the sanctions have had.
Thank you very much. Beth, you have over 30 years of U.S. national security experience and have served in leadership positions with the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. So from this experience and from your perspective, how might the growing North Korea-Russia partnership impact how our government views the North Korean threat?
Well, I think that it isn't a surprise at all to the administration that there's a problem in North Korea, and how they're increasing testing and their growing capabilities pose a threat. In some ways, I'm going to take a more positive view here, in that I think that the North Korea threat is one I've been talking about for years, thanks to Marcus educating me. But this is a real underappreciated threat. And I think that the Russian collaboration, in terms of focusing on this North Korea threat, does, kind of turn the lights on and open the curtains a little bit about why it is that we need to be able to walk and chew gum and think about multiple threats at the same time. And we need to start reorienting our strategies across multiple threats. And, I think it solidifies people's understanding. It should anyway, what Prime Minister Kishida and others in the region have been talking about, that there is this linkage between the Russia threat in Europe and the Russia, China, North Korea threat in Asia, and the Russia, China, Iran collaboration, and how that creates, encourages destabilization in the Middle East. All these things don't work for China, and we can talk about that. But I think that, the main thing here is that it is forcing us to really focus. One last point on this, people have talked about, I've seen a couple of things that, maybe this is an opportunity for us to get China to help restrain North Korea. I don't think that that is actually in the cards right now. It will be important for us to have these conversations, but China has its own issues with North Korea, but it's going to have different red lines than us. And they're going to apply pressure when and if they believe it's necessary, not because this isn't an opening for U.S. China collaboration, I don't think.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Herbst, I'm going to ask you to just follow up on that, because Beth mentioned this idea of handling multiple threats at a time. That comes up a lot when we talk about Russia and Ukraine. How do you see this connecting to attention to Ukraine and addressing the threat of Russia?
I think Beth's point is right on. We have a problem today, a really serious problem today, because two major powers, one, our only nuclear peer power, Russia, the other, our true competitor, our long-term adversary, China, our true adversary because it has a real economy, unlike Russia's not quite real, not fully developed economy, are working in tandem to undermine our interests and to promote essentially global instability by cutting against the rules of the road that have been established over the past, you could say the past 75 years since the end of World War II, and certainly over the past 30 years since the end of the Cold War. And they are working in tandem. Moscow is the, you might say, the current edge of this because it's committing actual aggression, as opposed to China's less obvious aggression, its island building in the South China Seas, for example. And so we have to stop Moscow. And this is well understood by our allies, not just in Europe, but also in the Far East. So one of the extraordinary moments last year, which speaks to this, was the fact that the Japanese, who are normally rather cautious in dealing with Russia, well, they visited Kiev the same day that Xi was in Moscow, a little bit less than a year ago, demonstrating clear support for Ukraine. And South Korea also understands, it's made this point publicly, to the ersatz American strategic thinkers who think that we can't afford to stop Russia and Ukraine because we have to worry about China and Taiwan. You know, South Korea, like Japan, like Taiwan, understand that the best way to stay China's hand in the Western Pacific is to pursue a stronger policy in Ukraine and defeat Putin there. So our allies in the Far East recognize how all these things are connected. I think the administration needs a stronger policy, making clear they understand these connections too. And the start of good policy, not just in Europe, but also in East Asia, is to do everything possible to defeat Putin in Ukraine. North Korea's sending weapons to Ukraine is just one more reason for South Korea to want to see Ukraine win. Because, as Marcus and Beth pointed out, North Korea is not doing this gratis for Russia.
You mean
And if
North Korea
Russia-
to Russia, not Ukraine, though inevitably in
Right,
Ukraine.
correct. Thank you. Yes, I misspoke. They'll get something in return. And if Moscow, in fact, enhances the military potential of North Korea, that's a direct danger to Japan and South Korea, but also to us. So it's time for us to get serious, recognize the connections, and pursue a strong policy worthy, not just of a superpower, but the world's still most powerful nation.
Thank you very much for that. Marcus, what do North Korea's shipments of weapons to Russia tell us about this threat posed by North Korea to global security today? And is the threat changing in nature and scope, but also how rapidly is it changing?
That's a great question. I think the nature of the threat is, from North Korea is changing its scope and its intensity, and it's happening rapidly and dramatically. So we recently put out a report titled "Deterrence in Korea is Crumbling. Here's How We Can Fix It." And this report really highlighted how much worse it's going to get 5 to 10 years from now. But we're already seeing so many signs of how it's worsening already, and particularly accelerating even in recent weeks. So I want to be clear, though, for those of you who have been tracking this in the media, there's been a lot of public speculation about the risk of war on the Korean Peninsula, based on a shift in propaganda coming out of Kim Jong-un and his party, the Korean Workers' Party. And particularly, this has involved abandoning the idea of reunification with South Korea and basically accepting that South Korea is going to be a permanent enemy. So this led to previously fairly dovish commentators to even claim that Kim Jong-un had made a strategic decision for war. So I don't agree that that's where we're headed. But I think it's important to acknowledge the risk of major, if still limited, aggression by North Korea is growing very rapidly. Pyongyang's used limited military provocations over the years for many purposes, demonstrating its strength versus the U.S.-South Korea alliance, showing strength domestically, and trying to instill fear, undermine confidence in South Korea and the ability of the alliance and U.S. extended deterrence to prevent North Korean resumption of aggression against South Korea. And so there's this history, there's this track record, but these incidents have been limited in scope, some of them lethal, but still fairly limited. But the next round of aggression could be really much, much worse than ever before, because North Korea's military capabilities have improved so much and expanded in recent years, including its nuclear capability. And it's got this new backing from Russia and this backing of and support from China, a little more quiet, but still very important, economically more important. And this gives North Korea increasing options and incentives to escalate. And so when you see what's been going on with their capabilities, it's been rapidly advancing in various important categories for years. The weapons development has just been making really great strides. And just in recent months, North Korea has tested a submarine-launched cruise missile, a land-based cruise missiles just earlier this month, new ballistic missiles designed to evade missile defenses, new intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of reaching the United States. And then last year, North Korea even displayed a new, smaller warhead design. Looks like it can fit on a much wider variety of missiles, making it very difficult to tell which is a nuclear-capable missile and which is not. And even can put this thing on potentially on an underwater drone that North Korea claims to have tested again this month. And so the growing alignment with North Korea by Russia and again by China really amplifies this danger. And so with all this in mind, the conditions for North Korea to conduct a localized attack with these improved capabilities while relying on its threat to escalate with nuclear weapons to protect the regime, to relying on the backing from Russia and the potential for Chinese intervention to basically cause us to hesitate and to prevent regime-ending consequences for North Korea. So they had a lot of options for how they could do such a thing, and I won't go into details. But if North Korea succeeds in this sort of limited attack, it could easily spiral into a larger conflict, nuclear exchange, or a larger war with China. But if it doesn't, it could put North Korea in a position where they achieve this localized win, and then the things return to the status quo, and then the Allies' confidence in the U.S. Is shaken, and the regime's position is greatly strengthened. So the dangers are absolutely real and growing. And then to your point, I think that the nature of the threat really is changing in scope, as well as the fact that North Korea now is a net provider of weapons, not just to various rogues gallery of states in the past, but even Russia is relying on North Korean weapons. Apparently, it just shows the progress that they've made in developing their arsenal and their capabilities.
Thank you very much for that. I just want to make it clear as well, how serious is the nuclear threat?
Yeah, so I think North Korea's nuclear capability is really quite serious, and so let's keep in mind that they've tested six nuclear tests so far, and they've tested a whole variety of nuclear capable delivery systems. And so we're talking about a capability that's not just theoretical, but one that is very real, and includes the ability to not only conduct attacks and to threaten, to intimidate, to deter with larger scale use, but also this growing capability to employ nuclear weapons tactically in a very limited way, with then falling back again on the threat of further nuclear escalation or Chinese intervention, for example, to then bring a conflict to a close. So I think the nuclear threat is absolutely very real.
Thank you. Beth, is there anything you want to add on that?
No, I think we'll move on to the next question. I guess I just, in terms of this just raises the point overall that, we can't just concentrate on a China threat, right? And we can't be isolationists, that the world gets a vote, and more these pariah states that we've kind of discounted are having more capabilities and more agency. And they are emboldened more than ever by being propped up by a Russia and a China in this mutually reinforcing way. And so we have to, as Ambassador Herbst said, and Marcus said, we have to kind of rescope our foreign policy, I think, to deal with these much more challenging threats.
Great.
And Shelby, if I can add to that
Please.
real quick. I'd like to build on something that Beth just said. The connection between the threats and challenges posed by China and North Korea is really key. And I know the subject here is the North Korea-Russia connection, but I think it's also very important to keep in mind that because of some of the common strategic interests and because of the geography that North Korea and China have, it's very likely that in the event that we are in a conflict with China, say over Taiwan, that it will draw in the Korean Peninsula, that the North Koreans have their own reasons to want to escalate, even if Beijing does not entice them or try and coerce them or encourage them to escalating, that the potential for North Korea to escalate either preemptively as U.S. forces are moving into the region or opportunistically as they see the U.S. is overcommitted the fight in China. I think this is a very important factor, and it's important to keep in mind that the outcome of a U.S.-China war would basically determine the fate of the region probably for generations to come. It would have huge implications for North Korea's regime, and so I really am skeptical of the idea that regardless of the circumstances, if this war, the hypothetical war I'm talking about, were really escalate, I don't see how North Korea is just going to sit on the sidelines and watch the conflict unfold. It has such important consequences for its own security, and so it's a big complicating factor having to deal with deterring China and North Korea at the same time. And I think the idea that we need to focus on China is the pacing threat and kind of therefore North Korea is not a priority. It really doesn't make sense because North Korea and China are just so interconnected threats and challenges. And then of course more broadly, as we're talking about here, North Korea, Russia, China also have their interconnections as well. So I think we have seen a lot of underestimation about how interconnected North Korea is with other threats, particularly in recent years, again, with this growing cooperation and certainly the favorable sort of protective approach that both Moscow and Beijing have taken toward North Korea.
Thank you. I'm glad you added that. I'd like to remind our audience that you can submit your questions at askac.org, and Marcus has opened it up, so you can also ask about how China fits in. Now, Ambassador Herbst, turning back to you. As the flow of North Korean arms shipments supplies Russia with military might, how could the U.S. and Ukraine's partners in the West take action to counter this flow and prevent Russia from accessing and utilizing North Korean weaponry against Ukraine? And also, how can we help Ukraine with their weaponry?
There are at least two aspects to this question. The most important, you might say the easiest, which is not to say it's something that will happen, would be to give Ukraine the arms it needs to make a difference on the battlefield. It's still true, and we've been talking about the relative sophistication of North Korean arms. It's still true that we and our allies make and possess the best weapons in the world. And we know that Russian arms exports have taken a hit as the world has seen the relative inadequacy of their performance in Ukraine since the big invasion. And there are weapon systems that we have, which we in fact are taking away from our own forces because we have better stuff coming in, whether we're talking about the 300-kilometer ATACMS, which the administration still refuses to send to Ukraine, whether we're talking about F-16s that we're only willing to send to Ukraine in tiny batches, whether we're talking about our Patriot systems, that we should be sending to Ukraine now and in much greater quantities. And if we do that, that will have an immediate positive effect on the battlefield. That's the relatively easy thing to do, which the administration is still rather timid in actually carrying out. The second thing, though, is we probably could find ways to make it harder on North Korea and on China as North Korea sends these weapons to Moscow. We already got a ton of sanctions on North Korea, not related to Moscow's war in Ukraine, and I'm sure Marcus knows far more about this, and Beth knows far more about this than I do. So it's directly sanctioning North Korea probably doesn't make too much sense. But if we were willing to sanction China, which raised a whole raft of difficult questions, so I understand that, maybe they would not be so keen on facilitating North Korean shipments to Russia, but also ending their own avoidance of our, especially tech restrictions to Russia. They are certainly doing this, and there's a lot more that we could be done that we could do to make it harder for China or more painful for China to do that. But here you run into the interdependency of the U.S. and the Chinese economy. Now you have vested American business interests that never want us to touch China because they have a stake in business there. That's a separate national security problem that we've got to get a handle on.
Great, thank you. Did you want to add anyone? No? Okay. Beth, to date, both North Korea and China only have one mutual defense treaty, and it's with one another exclusively. So how does this changing relationship between North Korea and Russia contribute to China's relationships with these countries?
You know, I think if you step back a little bit and you think about what China's strategic interests are, they are so different than where Russia, North Korea, and Iran are in this equation, right? That China is not under crushing sanctions. They're not international pariahs. They're an export driven economy that depends on trade with Europe and the United States. They want to right now, President Xi appears to want to have at least a relatively stable, more stabilized relationship with the United States. And so I think what's going on with North Korea, Russia, and I think we're going to see a lot more with Russia, Iran. And we see what Iran is doing and supporting the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. We can really see that these relationships between Russia and these two other rogue states create dilemmas for China. Right. And so, on the surface, you can say, like, oh, well, this is all good, right? China benefits because, North Korea is propping up Russia in its war against Ukraine, and China doesn't want Russia to lose. And it allows another actor, this more rogue actor, to take more of the center stage and not China. You can see lots of benefits for China on the surface in terms of challenging the U.S. international led order. But if you dig down another layer, it creates huge dilemmas for them they want to maintain leverage over North Korea. They don't want instability on the peninsula. They don't want to get dragged into war on the peninsula that's not of their own choosing. And so, this Russia support for North Korea definitely creates problems for China, and I'm sure makes them quite uncomfortable, especially the level of conversation that they're having. So I think we're going to see a Xi meeting with Kim this year. We're seeing vice foreign ministers kind of going back and forth now the last few months, and there's going to be, I'm sure, an effort by China to kind of solidify these relationships and to probably, try to put a lid on activities. But in some ways, it takes some of the control away from China, and it makes them uncomfortable, just like what Iran is doing in the Middle East. And I think that if this interstate deal goes through and Russia sends Su-35s, fighter jets, like actually builds Iran's air force and continues to help North Korea on their weapons programs, that's not necessarily in China's interest. And we should be emphasizing that. We should be having policies that, especially this connection between the Europe and the Asian threat picture. China hates that because it solidifies our alliances. It solidifies the Japan-South Korea alliance and the Japan-Philippine alliance, and all these things that China dislikes about the Biden administration policies. This makes it harder. So we should just be doubling down on that and make China understand that none of these things are really in their long-term interests.
Thank you very much. Marcus, let me give you my last question, and then we will turn to audience questions. And we've got a lot of good questions, but keep them coming, people. So Marcus, shifting back to North Korea's neighborhood, can you expand on how South Korea is supporting Ukraine? Do they see themselves aligned as a defender of democracy and sovereignty in the face of aggressive authoritarian threats? And if so, how might they help counter these threats?
Yeah, so South Korea is walking a very careful line, right now, and so certainly, you do see, solidarity and support from South Korea, and South Korea, is definitely a democracy, an ally of the United States, a partner of NATO. But on the other hand, I think South Korea has real concerns about its relationship with Russia, and not wanting to have a complete break there. And then also, again, this is a place where South Korea also has to tread carefully because of concerns about security in its own neighborhood, right? And so, for example, selling weapons to Poland, the major arms deals there, and then to recent deal that just saw in the news to actually sell artillery to Romania as well. And these are things that that sort of fall within the existing framework of South Korea's efforts to expand its defense exports, build its domestic defense industrial base, which also builds capacity then if it needs to build up or sustain for a conflict with North Korea. But South Korea at this point is not shipping weapons directly to Ukraine, even though in many ways I would argue it is potentially helping to really backfill the resources necessary to be able to provide continued support to Ukraine. And then the fact that South Korea, is itself so important, I think, to the overall, U.S. Led for that term that we always hear, international order. Although we know that that's the order itself is being undermined at multiple turns. I think overall, I would say yes, South Korea is supporting Ukraine, but in the context, I think of a larger strategy, a larger network of relationships, rather than in a purely bilateral sense.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, we are now going to turn to audience questions. Beth, I will start with you. This is a question from Drac Kopransky. Was the current relationship between North Korea and Russia a great surprise, or was it long anticipated or simply inevitable?
That's a really good question. I feel like, Putin had been courting Kim for some time and not really getting a lot of love from Kim. But, North Korea has been playing the trilateral leverage policy between Russia and China since Kim's granddad. So, I mean, it's not like they're not experienced in this. And in some ways, I think Kim, maybe playing a little hard to get with Russia at times, plays into that. But it is inevitable. We haven't talked about North Korea's domestic economic situation, but just earlier this week, maybe yesterday even, Kim was speaking, at one of the party meetings, and he acknowledged how bad the economy is. And, we always have difficulty really knowing how bad it is, and our information lags, but it's not good. So there are reasons for North Korea to be reaching out for weapons reasons, for the saber rattling against South Korea. Some of that is also for domestic reasons. Maybe Kim will be able to send more laborers. Like, it's always more of a complex relationship than simply like one dimensional. Here are weapons and you help me on these weapons. There's always more going on there. And I think it is kind of inevitable given the whole global context, because Kim has been on Team Russia since the invasion for, again, just kind of how he sees his place in the world and what his strategic goals are.
Great, thank you. Okay, Ambassador Herbst, I've got two questions for you from Jim and Anderson. Let's start with the first one. Do you consider North Korea's weapons supply to be a game changer in the Ukraine war?
No, I consider it to be a game continuer. In other words, as I've already mentioned, Moscow just used a hell of a lot of weapons, of ordnance in the first 6 months of the invasion, with only limited effect, besides just the massive destruction of infrastructure and people's lives, but not military effect. And it began to run out. And these deals with North Korea and Iran have enabled Russia to almost keep up the pace, even not then fully keep up the pace. That's all. It's a lot, but it's not a game changer.
Okay, second question. Bloomberg reported earlier today that Russia is engaging in unofficial talks with the United States about a potential ceasefire in the Ukraine war. If a ceasefire occurs, would it lead to the cessation of arms trading and military cooperation between North Korea and Russia? And if so, what changes might occur? Could there be a shift in North Korea's attitude, which has relied on a close relationship with Russia?
I first need to talk about the report itself before answering your question. There has been an extraordinary amount of bad information, worse analysis, even by so-called experts, my colleagues, regarding Russian peace intentions. If you listened to things that Putin's senior Russian officials say publicly, they are still seeking maximal victory in Ukraine, meaning subjugation of Ukraine. If you listen to the Russian media, you hear the same, plus the genocidal instincts of destroying Ukrainians for being Ukrainians. Then you have a careful whisper campaign by the Kremlin about possible interest in peace talks. And this is used to make gullible Westerners think that a real peace deal, meaning one that could lead to peace that would be good for all the people of Ukraine, is possible, when at this point there's no Russian intention to actually do that. So these stories are a testimony to the lack of clear thinking of the reporters and the publishers of such stories. Now, having said that, were there to be legitimate peace talks where Russia was willing to give up its imperial ambitions in Ukraine, but you still have the issue of Russian troops there and territory, then perhaps the whole question of Korean and other arms supplies to Russia would be a serious one. But again, because Moscow's intention remains to win this war on its terms, and the only way they can do that is if Western aid ceases or sharply drops, which is why Putin is hoping against hope, or hoping that the small band of isolationists in the House of Representatives who have no clue about American interests have their way. He feeds these rumors to get us to lower our guard and to stop providing Ukraine the support it needs to win, and that we need to protect our interest, because Putin's objectives will go beyond Ukraine. And we will find ourselves paying far more for defense if Putin were to win in Ukraine.
Thank you. Marcus, I want to turn to you on the second part of that question. If there was a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, would it change the North Korea-Russia relationship?
Wow, that's a question I really hadn't thought about. So I guess you could proceed from the premise that Russians' need for weaponry would be reduced in the event of a ceasefire. But we're sort of piling hypotheticals on hypotheticals here, and I would argue the larger trend in the Russia-North Korean relationship has been significantly positive, and so I wouldn't necessarily think that this would cause a break or a fundamental step back, but certainly without the near-term incentive for arms from North Korea, maybe that reduces the reasons for Russia to provide some more advanced hardware and economic support funds, et cetera, to North Korea. But I don't think it changes the relationship. Maybe it just changes the pace. But again, I hadn't really thought about this one before, so it's an interesting hypothetical, but very much hypothetical, because I suspect that we're not going to have a ceasefire anytime soon, based on what John just pointed out.
Thank you. And I'll say well done to our audience, because we like bringing in new ideas in the Q&A.
And
Our next
can I just
question,
add to that? Can I
yes,
just add to
please.
that, Shelby? I mean, I think that, there are strategic differences there are differences in the strategic interests of each of these states, right? And so how those play out in a post-war circumstance is really what's going to matter, right? And that depends on a large part of what Russia's strategic goals are going to be in a post-war situation, and how threatened they continue to feel, and what their ambitions will be post-war. I mean, if you look at Iran and China, or Iran and Russia, for example, they're creating mechanisms, especially through trade and trade corridors, that are going to be hard to undo. They're investing in things because they both need those in the context that's going to continue. But at the same time, Iran and Russia have very different and conflicting and competing strategic interests in the Middle East. And it's the same with, I think, Russia and North Korea. So we'll just have to see how that plays out. But the context of what Russia wants is going to be also very important here. We don't know what the parameters of any conclusion of this war are at this point.
Great, thank you. Beth, I'm going to give you this next question as well from Taro Yamada. Putin said he's interested in visiting the disputed Kuril Islands territories. Is he getting more aggressive in the region too because of North Korea's growing support for Russia?
Not because of North Korea's support for Russia. I mean, China and Russia have been colluding in threatening our allies in the Pacific for some years now, right? I mean, if you sat in Tokyo or any part of Japan, you would know that the Russians and the Chinese militaries love to circumnavigate at least once a year the Japanese islands in with bombers and fighters and naval vessels. And these disputed islands have been an issue for some time between Japan and Russia. Russia has become more aggressive on this way before this kind of North Korea situation has come out. I don't know, maybe Marcus can answer whether there's any connection to claimed territories that I'm not thinking of, but I do think that the whole idea is that all of our adversaries in Asia right now are becoming more aggressive against our partners and allies, and this creates dilemmas for us because they are not conceding this space. So no matter if Xi and Biden have, a great meeting in San Francisco, the behaviors generally have not changed. And we're seeing this aggression against the Philippines, a treaty ally that we have said that we are going to come to the aid of if they are directly attacked. It is happening with North Korea. It is happening related to Japan and the East China Sea and with these claimed islands. So I think it's all kind of connected and they're mutually emboldened.
Marcus, anything to add?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not going to speculate, specifically on what you mentioned about, Putin potentially making that visit, but I think more broadly, it's important to keep in mind that despite the fact that Russia is obviously, for the moment, very focused on the conflict, its aggression against Ukraine, its invasion and occupation of Ukrainian territory, that Russia does have significant interests in the Russian Far East, in the Northeast Asian region in particular. It has very strong interests in what happens on the Korean Peninsula, and keep in mind it does share a land border again with North Korea, even though it's very narrow. As Beth pointed out, it maintains a great deal of military air activity and a naval presence, out in the Russian Far East. And so I think there's this tendency, and rightly so, to really view China as the lead actor, a most powerful actor, potential adversary in the region. But we shouldn't count out Russia and its potential role to play a spoiler or to in some way support and enable North Korea or China. And just Russia is an additional complicating factor. And given the fact that there is this longstanding territorial dispute, and that Russia does have a history of being a peacekeeper, and that's a great joke I once heard, is Russia takes a piece of territory and keeps it. That I could definitely imagine scenarios in which Russia really ups the ante in terms of its territorial disputes, with Japan, militarizes the situation to a much greater degree. So I wouldn't rule that out. I just don't think it's very likely in the near term because of the ongoing Russian aggression against Ukraine and the way this conflict has been going. But to go back to this whole idea is if at some point the conflict ends, whether through negotiated ceasefire or some other method, how this plays out, I wouldn't rule out the idea that Russia becomes then more aggressive, more assertive, in the Far East as well. And so I think there's this tendency to kind of count out Russia's Far Eastern military capabilities and potential for aggression there. And I don't think we should neglect that possibility.
Thank you. Okay, Ambassador Herbst, I've got a question for you from Laurel Atkinson. She says, given the war in Ukraine is now one of attrition, has its duration plus sanctions not simply pushed Russia closer to North Korea for weapons and made this a question of an arsenal of autocracy, but has this indeed favored U.S. military industries per se, meaning that the longer this war continues, it also favors U.S. military industries, which is proving detrimental to global security per se, as the strength of weapons and increasing ballistic testing, especially by North Korea, increases?
I think that that's a very interesting question, but there's also some confusion within the question. If you believe that stopping aggression bordering on genocide, which is what we're seeing in Ukraine, is a good thing to do, then the weapons that help achieve that are a contribution to global stability and also a moral good. During World War II, we called what the questioner refers to as the military-industrial complex. We called that the arsenal of democracy, and it was. It was the American arms industry that, more than anything else, defeated the Germans in at least Western Europe. You have to give the Soviets their due, and the Japanese. I believe, and I've said this for 2 years now, that American policy to Russian aggression in Ukraine, especially since the big invasion, has been too timid. If we, in fact, sent Ukraine the weapons Ukraine has asked for, and the weapons that smart analysts like Phil Breedlove, Generals Breedlove and Hodges and Clark have talked about, Ukraine would have recovered most of the territory Moscow has seized since the war began, certainly in 2022, since the invasion of 2022, but since the war began in 2014. And in fact, the war would not be lasting as long. But among the failings of the administration since the big invasion, one I've talked about repeatedly in this hour, meaning the failure to send the more advanced weapons, although not far from our most advanced, has been the failure to ramp up our own military production so that we can give Ukraine what it needs and answer our own needs. What we've learned as a result of Moscow's big invasion of Ukraine is that war with major powers is ammunition and equipment intensive. And so to prepare for further Russian aggression, to prepare for Chinese aggression, we need to substantially ramp up our arms industry, which we have yet to do. And our allies need to do the same. Now, it is true, if you're a cynic, that that will be good for those industries, for those companies. But it's also true, again, if you believe that protecting the world from aggression, preventing major power war, preventing genocide is a moral good, then once again, we need to be the arsenal of democracy.
Well, I think that is quite a strong note to end on. So thank you so much to our panelists for joining us. Sorry to everyone who's excellent and very interesting questions I didn't get to, but keep an eye on the Atlantic Council as we'll continue to watch this. And thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.